Hey guys. Tonight we begin with why pharaohs slept with their sisters and somehow convinced an entire civilization this was not only normal, but absolutely necessary for cosmic balance. Turns out keeping it in the family wasn't just a quirky royal hobby. It was supposedly the only thing standing between Egypt and complete universal chaos. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through one of history's most awkward family traditions. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient Egyptian royal marriages. Most people think these sibling unions were just about keeping power in the family, like some ancient version of a family business where you don't want outsiders messing with the secret recipe. In reality, the Egyptians believed their pharaohs were literally gods walking around in human bodies, and mixing divine blood with regular human blood was basically cosmic contamination. Think of it like trying to keep your premium gas tank pure. You wouldn't want to dilute that high-octane divinity with regular unleaded peasant blood, would you? This wasn't some romantic fairy tale about destined soulmates who just happened to share the same parents. It was a calculated theological decision based on the belief that pharaohs were the earthly incarnation of the god Horus, and their sisters were manifestations of Isis. According to Egyptian mythology, Horus married his sister Isis, so naturally, their human representatives had to follow suit. It's like cosmic method acting, except instead of temporarily becoming your character, you had to marry your sister and rule Egypt. The whole system was built on maintaining what they called divine purity. Regular humans could marry whoever. They wanted cousins, neighbors, that cute farmer from the next village over. But pharaohs? They were stuck in the world's most exclusive and awkward dating pool. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern relationship counselor. Well, doctor, we're having some issues. But breaking up would literally cause the Nile to stop flooding and plunge the kingdom into eternal darkness. Talk about relationship pressure. And here's the kicker. It wasn't even consistently practiced. Some pharaohs married sisters, some married half-sisters, some married daughters, and some said, forget this, and married completely unrelated people, apparently gambling that the gods wouldn't notice or were maybe too busy to care. The inconsistency suggests that even the ancient Egyptians weren't entirely convinced this was necessary, but nobody wanted to be the pharaoh who ended the world by marrying outside the family tree. Ancient Egypt, from roughly 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, wasn't the mystical, perfectly organized civilization you see in Hollywood. Movies where everyone wears pristine white linen and speaks in dramatic whispers. It was a complex, often chaotic society where religious beliefs, political necessity, and human nature crashed into each other like a three-way chariot accident. The Nile River Valley wasn't some peaceful agricultural paradise. It was a narrow strip of fertile land surrounded by desert, where survival depended on the annual flood cycle and the ability to organize thousands of people to build massive monuments to dead kings. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, he was the living connection between the human world and the realm of the gods. If you thought modern politicians had pressure, imagine being responsible for literally keeping the universe running smoothly. Bad harvest? Pharaoh's fault. Plague? Definitely the pharaoh. Locusts? The pharaoh clearly wasn't doing his cosmic job properly. This divine responsibility created a system where pharaohs couldn't just be good administrators. They had to maintain their god status through every aspect of their lives, including who they married. The priesthood controlled massive amounts of wealth and land, and they were the ones interpreting what the gods wanted. If you thought modern religious leaders had influence, Egyptian priests could literally make or break dynasties by declaring that the pharaoh had fallen out of favor with the gods. They controlled the temples, managed the economy, and decided which royal marriages were divinely approved. It's like having your wedding planner also be your boss, your banker, and the person who decides whether you go to heaven. If you thought ancient Egypt was a stable, unchanging civilization, think again. It went through multiple periods of civil war, foreign invasion, economic collapse, and political chaos. Different dynasties rose and fell, sometimes within a single generation. Foreign rulers conquered Egypt, native dynasties fought back, and through it all, the marriage customs evolved and adapted to political necessity. Sometimes sibling marriage was absolutely required. Sometimes it was ignored. And sometimes, pharaohs married foreign princesses to secure alliances while keeping sister wives on the side for religious purposes. The geographic isolation created by the desert borders meant that Egyptian culture developed its own unique solutions to universal problems. While other civilizations were developing different approaches to royal succession and legitimacy, Egypt doubled down on the divine pharaoh concept. This isolation also meant that practices that might seem bizarre to outsiders became completely normal within Egyptian society. When your entire worldview is built around the idea that your king is literally a god, marrying his sister starts to seem like basic common sense rather than a shocking violation of social norms. Meet Cleopatra 7. No, not the Hollywood version, with perfect makeup and dramatic speeches, but the real Cleopatra, who was the product of at least 6 generations of sibling marriage and somehow still managed to be one of the most politically savvy rulers in ancient history. Her family tree looked less like a tree and more like a telephone pole, with branches that kept growing back into themselves in ways that would make a genealogist weep. Cleopatra's parents were siblings, her grandparents were siblings, and her great-grandparents were also siblings. At family reunions, everyone was literally everyone else's cousin, aunt, uncle, and sibling all at the same time. But here's where it gets interesting. Cleopatra broke the family tradition. Instead of marrying her brother Ptolemy XIII, she was supposed to marry her younger brother. She decided that politics trumped tradition and had relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a calculated political move to save Egypt from Roman conquest. She basically looked at 300 years of family tradition and said, you know what? Maybe it's time to try dating outside the family. The irony is that her brother husband Ptolemy XIII, who was probably around 10 years old when they were married, wasn't particularly thrilled about sharing power with his sister wife. Egyptian royal marriages weren't exactly romantic partnerships. They were political alliances between people who happened to share parents. Imagine being 10 years old and suddenly being told you're married to your older sister, and now you have to help her rule Egypt. It's like the world's most awkward arranged marriage combined with the ultimate workplace power struggle. Cleopatra's decision to pursue relationships with Roman leaders instead of following traditional Egyptian marriage customs was seen as scandalous by some and pragmatic by others. The Egyptian priests were probably pulling their hair out, thinking, great, now the gods are going to be angry because the pharaoh is dating foreigners instead of keeping the bloodline pure. Meanwhile, Cleopatra was thinking, well, keeping the bloodline pure isn't going to stop the Roman legions from conquering Egypt, so maybe it's time for Plan B. The political consequences were enormous. By abandoning traditional marriage practices, Cleopatra was essentially abandoning the religious foundation of pharaonic legitimacy. But by forming alliances with Caesar and Antony, she was trying to preserve Egyptian independence through personal diplomacy. It's like choosing between following your family's religious traditions and saving your entire country from foreign conquest. Not exactly an easy decision. And if you think that's complicated, Wait until you hear about what happened to Cleopatra's children. Her son with Caesar was named Caesarion, and her children with Antony were raised as both Egyptian royalty and Roman aristocrats. These kids were caught between two completely different cultural systems: Egyptian divine kingship and Roman republicanism. Imagine trying to explain to your children that they're simultaneously gods. Romans and Egyptians and also their great-great-grandparents were all siblings. The ultimate irony is that Cleopatra, who broke centuries of sibling marriage tradition to save Egypt, ended up being the last pharaoh. After her death, Egypt became a Roman province, and the entire system of divine pharaonic rule came to an end. So you could argue that abandoning traditional marriage customs was either a desperate attempt to save the kingdom or the final nail in the coffin of Egyptian independence, depending on your perspective. This wasn't just about awkward family dynamics or keeping wealth concentrated among relatives. The marriage practices of Egyptian pharaohs were literally believed to maintain cosmic order. According to Egyptian religious beliefs, the pharaohs' marriage choices could determine whether the Nile flooded properly, whether the sun would rise each morning, and whether the afterlife would continue functioning correctly. No pressure or anything, but your wedding guest list might determine the fate of the universe. The economic implications were staggering. Pharaohs controlled vast resources: gold mines, agricultural land, trade routes, and thousands of workers. A marriage alliance could shift the balance of power between different noble families, priesthoods, and regional governors. When pharaohs married within their family, it meant that all that wealth and power stayed concentrated in one bloodline. When they married outside the family, it created new power centers that could potentially challenge royal authority. The religious establishment had enormous stakes in maintaining traditional marriage practices. The priests derived their authority from interpreting divine will. And if pharaohs started ignoring religious traditions about marriage, it raised uncomfortable questions about what other traditions might be optional. If the pharaoh could marry whomever he wanted, maybe he didn't need the priest to validate his divine status. Maybe the whole system of religious authority was more flexible than everyone thought. Foreign powers were watching Egyptian marriage politics closely. A pharaoh who married a foreign princess was signaling potential alliance or submission. A pharaoh who maintained traditional sibling marriage was declaring independence and divine authority. These marriage choices were essentially ancient diplomatic statements, broadcast to every neighboring kingdom. We are Egyptian gods, and we don't need your approval, versus we are practical politicians open to negotiation. The common people had their own stakes in royal marriage practices. Traditional marriages reinforced the idea that pharaohs were fundamentally different from regular humans, gods who followed divine laws rather than human customs. Non-traditional marriages suggested that pharaohs were just people with impressive job titles, which could be either reassuring or terrifying, depending on your perspective. If your king was a god, at least you knew the universe was in divine hands. If your king was just a person, then the responsibility for keeping everything running fell on human institutions that might fail. But Cleopatra and her romantic rebellions were just the end of a story that began over 3,000 years earlier, when the first pharaohs were trying to figure out how to convince an entire civilization that they were gods worthy of absolute obedience. The sibling marriage tradition didn't start as a romantic ideal or even a political strategy. It began as a desperate attempt to solve the fundamental problem of divine kingship. How do you maintain God status in a human body that ages, dies, and needs to produce heirs? The earliest pharaohs faced a theological nightmare. They claimed to be gods, but gods don't usually have succession problems. When Zeus needed a successor, he didn't have to worry about bloodlines or marriage alliances. He just kept being Zeus. But human pharaohs died, which meant they needed to produce divine heirs who could continue the god-king tradition. This created a logical puzzle that Egyptian theologians spent centuries trying to solve. How do you maintain divine purity across generations of human reproduction? The answer they came up with was ingenious, disturbing, and ultimately doomed. To create exactly the kind of political and genetic complications you'd expect from a system based on marrying your siblings. But before we dive into the full horror show of Egyptian royal genetics, we need to understand how this whole system got started and why it seemed like a good idea at the time. The Egyptian concept of divine marriage wasn't just royal tradition. It was cosmic maintenance. Unlike modern monarchies where kings and queens are fancy politicians with crowns, Egyptian pharaohs were literally believed to be gods temporarily wearing human costumes. The marriage system was designed to keep these divine costumes properly fitted across generations, which created the ancient world's most exclusive and problematic dating service. The theological logic was actually quite sophisticated, in a completely bonkers sort of way. According to Egyptian creation mythology, the gods regularly married their siblings to maintain cosmic balance. The sun god, Rhea, married his sister. Geb, the earth god, married his sister, Nut, the sky goddess. And most importantly for royal marriage, customs. Osiris married his sister Isis. These weren't scandalous family secrets. They were the fundamental relationships that kept the universe functioning. So when pharaohs married their sisters, they weren't violating social norms. They were literally reenacting the cosmic order that prevented reality from falling apart. This created what we might call the divine photocopying problem. Each generation of pharaohs needed to be perfect copies of their divine parents, which theoretically required identical genetic material. It's like trying to maintain the perfect recipe by only using ingredients from the original batch. Eventually, you're going to run into some quality control issues. But the Egyptians believed that diluting royal blood with commoner genes would be like adding water to premium wine. You might get more liquid, but you definitely get less divinity. The practical implementation of this system required an entire bureaucracy of priests, genealogists, and marriage negotiators, whose job was to figure out exactly how closely related potential royal spouses needed to be to maintain divine purity, without producing heirs who were too genetically compromised to actually rule. It's like having a team of religious wedding planners whose specialty is arranging marriages that would make modern geneticists flee in terror, while somehow keeping the kingdom functioning. The irony is that this system, designed to maintain divine perfection, created pharaohs who were often physically and mentally compromised by generations of inbreeding. But rather than questioning the system, Egyptian theologians developed increasingly complex explanations for why their god-kings sometimes couldn't walk properly or speak clearly. Divine mystery, they called it. Modern medicine would call it something else entirely. Take Pharaoh Akhenaten, whose family tree looked like it had been designed by someone with a serious misunderstanding of how trees work. Akhenaten married his sister Nefertiti, which was standard procedure. But their children inherited a collection of physical abnormalities that would have made ancient Egyptian medical texts read like horror stories. Akhenaten himself had an elongated skull, feminine hips, and what archaeologists politely describe as unusual body proportions. Modern analysis suggests he might have had Marfan syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, or possibly both, courtesy of generations of keeping the gene pool roughly the size of a puddle. But here's where it gets really interesting. Akhenaten's physical problems didn't disqualify him from being pharaoh. Instead, Egyptian court artists developed an entirely new artistic style that portrayed these genetic abnormalities as divine features. Suddenly, having an oddly shaped head and feminine curves wasn't a sign of inbreeding problems. It was evidence of divine transcendence beyond normal human physical forms. It's like having such bad acne that you convince everyone it's actually a sign of holiness. The court artists basically created ancient Egypt's first Instagram filter, except instead of smoothing out imperfections, they turned genetic disorders into religious iconography. Akhenaten's marriage to Nefertiti produced 6 daughters, which created another problem: no male heirs. The solution was typically Egyptian in its creative approach to family relationships. Akhenaten apparently married at least 2 of his own daughters to ensure royal succession. One allegedly produced Tutankhamun, making King Tut simultaneously Akhenaten's son and grandson. Family reunions must have required name tags with relationship flowcharts. Another fascinating example involves Pharaoh Amenhotep II, who managed to marry his sister, his half-sister, and at least 3 of his daughters simultaneously. This wasn't serial monogamy. This was ancient Egypt's version of collecting the entire set. Egyptian records describe these multiple marriages as ensuring divine harmony, but they read more like someone was trying to corner the market on royal bloodlines. Amenhotep's court had to develop an elaborate protocol for determining which wife got which ceremonial duties, which must have made palace dinners incredibly awkward. One court document allegedly describes a dinner party where Amenhotep had to sit between his sister wife and his daughter wife, while his half-sister wife sat across from his other daughter wife. The seating arrangements alone probably required a team of protocol specialists with advanced degrees in genealogy. Modern wedding planners complain about difficult family dynamics, but at least they don't have to figure out whether someone is sitting in the sister section or the daughter section. The children from these multiple sibling marriages often had their own marriage complications. Princess Saidaman, who was simultaneously Amenhotep's daughter and wife, eventually married her half-brother, who was also her stepson. Their children would have needed professional genealogists just to figure out what to call their relatives. Daddy grandpa and mommy aunt were apparently legitimate family relationship terms in ancient Egyptian royal households. Perhaps most bizarrely, Egyptian medical texts from this period describe treatments for what they called divine fertility. Challenges: basically, medical interventions for when inbreeding made reproduction difficult or impossible. Palace physicians developed elaborate rituals and treatments to help closely related royal couples produce viable heirs. These treatments range from herbal remedies that probably didn't work to religious ceremonies that definitely didn't work, all designed to overcome the biological consequences of a marriage system that seemed designed to create exactly these problems. The court records show that palace life included regular consultations with fertility specialists, genetic counselors, though they didn't call them that, and religious advisors who tried to determine when genetic problems were signs of divine displeasure versus when they were just the natural result of marrying your sister for 6 consecutive generations. One particularly detailed papyrus describes a palace conference where priests, doctors, and royal advisors spent 3 days trying to determine whether the crown prince's inability to produce male heirs was because he wasn't praying hard enough, or because his parents were too closely related. The conclusion, apparently, was that more prayers were needed. But it wasn't that simple, because Egyptian royal marriage practices were riddled with more contradictions than a philosophical debate between drunk teenagers. While the official religious doctrine demanded sibling marriage to maintain divine purity, the political reality often required exactly the opposite: marriages with foreign royalty to secure alliances, prevent wars, or legitimize conquests. Many pharaohs solved this problem through what we might call marriage portfolio diversification. They'd marry their sister for religious legitimacy, then marry a Nubian princess for southern border security, a Mesopotamian princess for trade agreements, and maybe a Libyan royal for good measure. It's like having a religious wife for ceremonial purposes and several political wives for practical diplomacy. The palace household management must have been a nightmare. These contradictory, Marriage strategies created competing claims to legitimacy that plagued Egyptian royal succession for centuries. Children from sibling marriages claimed superior divine status, while children from foreign marriages claimed stronger political connections. Half-siblings with different mothers often ended up in civil wars, each claiming to be the rightful heir based on different aspects of Egyptian royal tradition. It's like having multiple inheritance laws that directly contradict each other, then being surprised when family disputes turn violent. The religious establishment was constantly trying to reconcile official doctrine with political necessity. Priests developed increasingly complex theological explanations for why some non-sibling marriages were divinely acceptable while others weren't. The criteria seemed to change based on political convenience rather than consistent religious principles. A marriage that was religiously scandalous when made by a weak pharaoh somehow became divinely inspired when made by a successful conqueror. Even more confusing, Egyptian historical records show that some of the most successful pharaohs completely ignored sibling marriage traditions, while some of the most disastrous rulers were products of multiple generations of brother-sister unions. This created a logical problem that Egyptian theologians never successfully resolved. If sibling marriage was necessary for divine legitimacy, why did it often produce incompetent rulers? If non-sibling marriage compromised divine status, why? Were foreign married pharaohs often more effective leaders? Different regions of Egypt sometimes followed different marriage customs, creating a patchwork of royal legitimacy standards that changed depending on local religious traditions and political alliances. Northern Egypt sometimes accepted marriage practices that southern Egypt considered religiously unacceptable, and vice versa. This meant that a pharaoh could be considered divinely legitimate in Memphis, but religiously compromised in Thebes, which made unified rule somewhat challenging. Modern analysis of Egyptian royal mummies suggests that the actual implementation of sibling marriage was far less consistent than official records claimed. DNA evidence indicates that many pharaohs who were officially recorded as children of sibling marriages were actually products of more genetically diverse unions. Either Egyptian record-keeping was remarkably inaccurate, or there was systematic falsification of royal genealogies to match religious expectations rather than biological reality. The result was a royal system that produced some of ancient Egypt's greatest leaders and some of its most spectacular disasters, often within the same dynasty. The genetic consequences of sustained sibling marriage created pharaohs who ranged from brilliant political strategists to rulers who apparently couldn't manage basic administrative tasks without extensive assistance from court advisors. The physical health problems were impossible to ignore, even with creative court artistry and religious explanations. Egyptian palace records describe elaborate medical support systems for pharaohs who suffered from genetic disorders that made basic royal duties challenging. Some pharaohs required assistance walking during religious ceremonies. Others needed help speaking during public appearances, and several apparently had cognitive impairments severe enough to require regent rulers who made decisions while the quantabos. Official pharaoh served as a ceremonial figurehead. Egyptian physicians developed what might be called the ancient world's first specialized royal medical service. Palace doctors became experts in treating the specific health problems that resulted from generations of inbreeding bone disorders, developmental abnormalities, fertility problems, and neurological conditions that were rarely seen in the general population. These medical specialists had to balance their professional knowledge with religious doctrine that insisted these conditions were divine mysteries rather than predictable consequences of royal marriage customs. The common people developed their own reactions to the obvious problems with royal marriage practices. Folk tales and popular songs from this period often featured stories about wise rulers who married outside their families, and foolish kings who insisted on traditional marriages, despite obvious problems. While these stories were probably too politically dangerous to tell directly, they suggest that ordinary Egyptians were well aware of the connection between royal marriage customs and royal competence. Regional governors and provincial administrators had to deal with the practical consequences of having pharaohs whose divine status was theoretically absolute, but whose actual capabilities were sometimes severely limited. This created an informal system of distributed governance where local officials made practical decisions while maintaining the fiction that they were simply implementing divine pharaonic wisdom. It's like having a constitutional monarchy where everyone pretends the monarch is actively governing while actually working around their limitations. The economic impact was enormous because supporting pharaohs with severe genetic disorders required massive palace bureaucracies, specialized medical care, and elaborate ceremonial systems designed to maintain royal dignity despite obvious physical and mental limitations. Resources that could have been used for infrastructure, military defense, or economic development were instead devoted to managing the consequences of a marriage system that seemed designed to create exactly these problems. Foreign powers learned to exploit Egyptian royal marriage customs for diplomatic advantage. Neighboring kingdoms would offer marriage alliances knowing that Egyptian pharaohs were caught between religious obligations to marry within their families and political necessities to secure foreign alliances. This created opportunities for manipulation where foreign powers could demand marriage agreements as tests of Egyptian commitment to treaties, knowing that accepting would compromise religious legitimacy while refusing would signal diplomatic weakness. Meanwhile, the Egyptian priesthood was developing increasingly elaborate theological explanations for why their divine marriage system seemed to produce such mixed results. Rather than questioning the fundamental premise that pharaohs needed to marry their sisters to maintain cosmic order, religious scholars doubled down on complexity, creating new categories of acceptable marriages, developing detailed guidelines for determining divine approval of various relationship configurations, and establishing elaborate rituals designed to sanctify unions that didn't quite meet traditional requirements. This theological creativity would eventually produce some of the most Byzantine marriage customs in ancient history, where pharaohs might simultaneously be married to their sister for religious purposes, their daughter for dynastic continuity, their half-sister for backup legitimacy, and a foreign princess for diplomatic relations. The palace household management required specialized bureaucrats whose entire job was keeping track of who was married to whom for what purpose, and which children from which marriages had claims to which aspects of royal succession. But even as the priesthood was making royal marriage customs more complex, the political reality of ruling Egypt was making them increasingly irrelevant. The rise of powerful regional governors, the growing influence of foreign merchants and diplomats, and the practical necessities of governing a large, diverse kingdom were creating pressures that no amount of divine marriage theory could address. The stage was being set for pharaohs who would have to choose between religious tradition and political survival, often with dramatic consequences for both themselves and the kingdom they claimed to rule as gods. If the divine marriage system was Egyptian theology's attempt to maintain cosmic order through careful family planning, then political marriage was reality's way of laughing at theology while pointing out that the rest of the world didn't particularly care about Egyptian cosmic theories. Political marriages were the ancient equivalent of realpolitik, practical diplomatic solutions that completely ignored religious doctrine in favor of not getting conquered by neighboring kingdoms who had their own ideas about proper royal behavior. Fundamental conflict was hilarious in its inevitability. Egyptian religious doctrine insisted that pharaohs were gods who needed to marry their sisters to maintain divine purity, while Egyptian political survival required alliances with foreign Powers who thought sibling marriage was either disgusting, ridiculous, or both. It's like being a vegetarian diplomat who keeps getting invited to barbecue summits. Your principles are admirable, but they're not particularly helpful for international relations. Foreign kingdoms approached Egyptian marriage diplomacy with the kind of bemused pragmatism you'd expect from people who weren't personally invested in Egyptian cosmic theory. Mesopotamian kings would offer their daughters in marriage to pharaohs with all the enthusiasm of someone trying to sell a used chariot to a customer who insists they only travel by divine levitation. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reads like negotiations between a fantasy novel and an accounting textbook. This created what we might call the theological flexibility problem. Egyptian priests had to figure out how to maintain the divine marriage doctrine while accommodating the political reality that successful pharaohs often needed to marry foreign princesses to prevent their kingdoms from being overrun by armies who didn't particularly care about Egyptian religious sensibilities. The solutions they developed were masterpieces of creative interpretation that would have impressed modern lawyers specializing in contract loopholes. The most common solution was marriage compartmentalization. Pharaohs would have different types of wives for different purposes. Sister wives for cosmic legitimacy, foreign wives for diplomatic relations, and occasionally daughter wives for extra divine insurance. It's like having separate wardrobes for different occasions, except instead of business casual and formal, where you had cosmic maintenance wives and international relations wives. Palace etiquette specialists probably needed advanced degrees in diplomatic theology just to figure out which wife should attend which ceremonial functions. The practical result was that Egyptian royal households became international diplomatic centers where multiple marriage systems coexisted in ways that satisfied nobody completely but prevented total disaster. Foreign princesses had to learn Egyptian religious customs that probably seemed completely insane, while Egyptian sister wives had to participate in diplomatic functions with women whose very presence technically compromised divine legitimacy. Palace dinner parties must have been phenomenally awkward affairs, where everyone was politely pretending that the fundamental contradictions in royal marriage doctrine weren't sitting right there at the table passing the bread. Consider the diplomatic marriage nightmare of Pharaoh Thutmose IV, who managed to simultaneously honor Egyptian religious tradition and international political necessity by marrying his sister Tia for divine legitimacy, then promptly marrying princesses from Mitanni, Babylon, and possibly Assyria for diplomatic purposes. This wasn't polygamy for personal enjoyment. This was ancient Egypt's version of a multinational corporate merger, where the CEO had to marry representatives from each subsidiary to ensure smooth business operations. The logistics alone were staggering. Each foreign princess arrived with her own retinue of servants, religious advisors, and cultural expectations that had to be accommodated within Egyptian palace protocol. The Mitanni princess worshipped different gods, followed different dietary restrictions, and had marriage customs that directly contradicted Egyptian religious law. The Babylonian princess brought her own priests who insisted on performing rituals that Egyptian priests considered either heretical or cosmically dangerous. Palace administrators had to develop separate protocol systems for different wives from different cultures while maintaining the fiction that everything was harmoniously unified under Egyptian divine authority. Court records describe the wedding feast for Thutmose IV's Mitanni marriage as a 3-day diplomatic disaster where Egyptian priests tried to perform traditional pharaonic wedding ceremonies while Mitanni officials insisted on their own marriage rituals, and nobody could agree on which gods should be invoked or what constituted appropriate ceremonial behavior. The final compromise apparently involved holding separate religious ceremonies for different audiences, which satisfied nobody but prevented immediate diplomatic incidents. The children from these International marriages created their own complications. Thutmose, the fourth son with his Egyptian sister wife, was the obvious heir according to Egyptian religious law, but his sons with foreign princesses had legitimate claims to thrones in their mothers' kingdoms. This created a generation of royal children who were simultaneously Egyptian princes, Mitanni nobles, and Babylonian aristocrats, each with different cultural expectations and political obligations that often directly contradicted each other. One particularly well-documented example involves Prince Amenhotep, who was simultaneously heir to the Egyptian throne through his Egyptian mother and heir to significant Mitanni territories through his Mitanni mother. Palace tutors had to teach him Egyptian divine kingship theory, Mitanni military tactics, and Babylonian commercial law, apparently without anyone noticing the inherent contradictions between these different systems of royal authority. His education included learning to be an Egyptian god-king, a Mitanni warrior prince, and a Babylonian merchant diplomat, which probably required the ancient equivalent of multiple personality disorder just to function socially. Another fascinating case study involves Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who took political marriage to its logical extreme by collecting foreign wives like some people collect stamps. He married princesses from virtually every neighboring kingdom, creating a royal household that functioned as an international diplomatic conference with permanent delegates who happened to be married to the host. Palace records indicate that he had designated days for conducting diplomatic business with different wife ambassadors, essentially turning marriage into a formal diplomatic communication system. The most bizarre example might be the marriage negotiations between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, where diplomatic correspondence survives showing both sides trying to arrange marriages while completely talking past each other about basic concepts like royal legitimacy, divine authority, and acceptable family relationships. The Hittite king kept offering his daughter in marriage while emphasizing her royal bloodline and political connections. The Egyptian pharaoh kept responding with concerns about divine purity and cosmic legitimacy that the Hittite king clearly thought were elaborate diplomatic code for something else entirely. The negotiations dragged on for years, with each side becoming increasingly frustrated by the other's apparent inability to understand basic diplomatic principles. The Hittite correspondence reads like someone trying to arrange a business merger, with a customer who keeps insisting that the deal must be approved by invisible cosmic authorities who communicate through family genealogy. The Egyptian correspondence reads like someone trying to maintain religious principles while dealing with business partners who seem completely oblivious to basic theological requirements. Eventually, they reached a compromise that satisfied nobody. The Hittite princess would marry the pharaoh, but she would be considered a diplomatic wife rather than a divine wife, which meant she could participate in political functions but not religious ceremonies. This created a new category of royal marriage that was neither traditionally Egyptian nor traditionally Hittite, but was politically acceptable to both sides. The princess essentially became a permanent diplomatic ambassador who happened to be married to her host country's leader, which probably made family visits home particularly complicated. This wasn't isolated weirdness. It was a systematic pattern that developed across multiple dynasties as Egyptian pharaohs repeatedly discovered that religious purity and political survival often required mutually exclusive strategies. The pattern was depressingly predictable. New pharaohs would start their reigns, emphasizing traditional sibling marriage for divine legitimacy, then gradually accumulate foreign wives as political pressures mounted, then spend the rest of their reigns trying to reconcile these contradictory marriage systems through increasingly creative theological interpretations. The pattern existed because Egypt's geographic position made political isolation impossible, while its religious system made cultural accommodation extremely difficult. Egypt controlled valuable trade routes and agricultural resources that neighboring kingdoms wanted to access, which created constant pressure for diplomatic marriages. But Egyptian religious doctrine treated these same diplomatic marriages as potential cosmic contamination, which meant that successful international relations required theological compromises that undermined the very divine authority that made pharaohs worth allying with. In the first place, Egyptian priests developed increasingly sophisticated explanations for why some foreign marriages were divinely acceptable while others weren't. But the criteria seemed to change based on political necessity rather than consistent religious principles. Marriages with powerful kingdoms that could provide military assistance were more likely to receive divine approval than marriages with smaller kingdoms that offered only minor trade advantages. It's like having religious principles that mysteriously align with practical benefits, which tends to make people suspicious about the sincerity of the religious principles. Social and economic factors reinforce this pattern because successful pharaohs needed resources to maintain the massive bureaucracies, military forces, and construction projects that demonstrated their divine authority. These resources often came from international trade and diplomatic agreements that required marriage alliances with foreign partners. The more successful a pharaoh was at accumulating wealth and power, the more likely he was to have foreign wives, whose very presence technically compromised his divine legitimacy. Comparison to other time periods and places reveals that Egypt wasn't unique in struggling with conflicts between religious marriage doctrine and political necessity, but Egyptian solutions were uniquely complicated because of their divine kingship system. Most other ancient civilizations solved this problem by treating royal marriages as primarily political arrangements with optional religious components. Egypt tried to maintain the fiction that all royal marriages were primarily religious arrangements with optional political benefits, which created logical contradictions that required constant theological creativity to resolve. The cyclical nature of this pattern suggests that each generation of Egyptian leaders had to rediscover the same fundamental conflicts between religious doctrine and political reality. Despite having detailed records of previous pharaohs' marriage complications, new rulers consistently underestimated the difficulty of balancing divine legitimacy requirements with international diplomatic necessities. It's like watching people repeatedly make the same mistake while having access to detailed instructions about why that mistake doesn't work, which suggests that the underlying system was fundamentally flawed rather than just poorly implemented. The effects were profound and far-reaching, creating a royal system that was simultaneously more internationally connected and more internally contradictory than either pure divine marriage or pure political marriage would have produced. Egyptian pharaohs became sophisticated international diplomats by necessity, developing skills in cross-cultural negotiation and multinational alliance management that were probably more advanced than their divine marriage training had prepared them for. Who benefited most were the foreign kingdoms that learned to exploit Egyptian theological contradictions for diplomatic advantage. Smart foreign rulers quickly figured out that they could use marriage negotiations to extract concessions from Egyptian pharaohs who were caught between religious obligations and political necessities. Marriage proposals became diplomatic weapons where foreign powers could demand favorable trade agreements, territorial concessions, or military assistance as prerequisites for marriages that Egyptian pharaohs needed for political survival, but couldn't officially acknowledge, wanting for non-religious reasons. Who suffered most were the women involved in these marriages, particularly foreign princesses who found themselves caught between incompatible cultural systems with no clear guidelines for success. Egyptian sister wives at least understood the religious expectations and court protocols, even if they had to share their husbands with foreign rivals. Foreign wives had to navigate Egyptian religious customs that often contradicted their own cultural backgrounds while competing for influence with sister wives, whose divine legitimacy they could never match. The unintended consequences were spectacular in their scope and creativity. Egyptian court protocol became so complex that palace administrators needed specialized training in international diplomacy, comparative religion, and genealogical record-keeping just to manage daily royal household operations. The attempt to maintain divine marriage purity while accommodating political marriage necessity created bureaucratic systems that were more complicated than either approach would have required independently. How this shaped future developments was crucial for understanding Egyptian political evolution. The marriage system trained pharaohs to think internationally while maintaining domestic religious authority, which prepared them for the cultural complexity they would need to manage Egypt's eventual integration into broader Mediterranean and Middle Eastern political systems. The skills Egyptian rulers developed managing contradictory marriage systems probably helped them adapt to the political realities of dealing with Greek, Roma, and other foreign powers who had very different ideas about royal legitimacy. Modern parallels are obvious to anyone familiar with contemporary political leaders who have to balance religious constituency expectations with international diplomatic requirements. The Egyptian pharaohs' marriage dilemmas were early examples of the fundamental tensions between domestic, ideological purity and international pragmatic cooperation that continue to complicate political leadership in religiously diverse societies. The lessons for contemporary issues include recognition that systems designed to maintain ideological purity often create practical problems that require exactly the kind of compromises the system was designed to prevent. Egyptian royal marriage customs demonstrate how institutional rigidity can force creative adaptations that ultimately undermine them original institutional goals while creating new problems that nobody anticipated when the system was first designed. Yet, even as Egyptian pharaohs were developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for balancing divine marriage requirements with political marriage necessities, the fundamental contradictions in their system were creating pressures that would eventually explode into dynastic crisis. The more successful pharaohs became at international diplomacy through strategic marriages, the more they undermined the religious foundations of their own authority. The more they emphasized divine legitimacy through traditional sibling marriages, the more they isolated themselves from the international alliances they needed for political survival. This tension was building toward a breaking point that would test whether Egyptian royal authority could survive the logical contradictions built into its own marriage system. The next generation of pharaohs would face choices that previous rulers had managed to avoid through creative theological interpretations and diplomatic compartmentalization. They would have to decide whether being Egyptian gods was more important than being effective rulers, and whether maintaining cosmic order was worth sacrificing political control over the actual kingdom. They claimed to rule as divine representatives. The stage was being set for royal marriage decisions that would determine not just individual dynastic succession, but the fundamental nature of Egyptian kingship itself. The marriage choices that had started as religious obligations and evolved into diplomatic strategies were about to become tests of whether the entire system of divine pharaonic authority could adapt to changing political realities, or whether it would collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. The stakes were no longer just cosmic order or political alliance. They were the survival of Egyptian civilization as an independent kingdom, ruled by god-kings. By the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty, around 305 BCE, the Egyptian royal marriage system had reached peak absurdity, a breaking point, where 3 centuries of sibling marriage had created a royal family that was less like a family tree and more like a family pretzel, twisted into shapes that defied both biological logic and political common sense. The Ptolemies, who were Greek rulers who had conquered Egypt, and decided to adopt Egyptian customs without really understanding why those customs existed, had turned royal marriage into an elaborate genetic experiment that would have made modern scientists weep with horror. The tensions had been building for generations as each successive Ptolemaic ruler tried to balance Greek political traditions, Egyptian religious requirements, and the increasingly obvious fact that their family breeding program was producing heirs who were physically and mentally unsuited for the basic requirements of royal authority. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Egypt was surrounded by Roman expansion. Internal rebellions were becoming more frequent, and the royal family's genetic problems were becoming too obvious to hide behind religious explanations about divine mystery. Key players included Ptolemy VIII, who was so physically repulsive that his own subjects nicknamed him Phiscon, meaning fatty or bloated. His sister wife Cleopatra II, who was apparently the only competent ruler in the family, and their brother Ptolemy VI, who was married to both of them at different times in arrangements that would have confused professional genealogists. The love triangle was less about romance and more about figuring out which combination of royal siblings could produce heirs who were genetically capable of basic human functions. The stakes involved the survival of Egyptian independence, the legitimacy of Greek rule over Egyptian subjects, and the question of whether 3 centuries of sibling marriage had permanently damaged the royal bloodline beyond repair. Palace physicians were producing increasingly desperate medical reports about royal fertility problems, cognitive impairments, and physical deformities that were becoming impossible to explain as divine features rather than obvious consequences of sustained inbreeding. The situation was complicated by the fact that Roman expansion was making Egyptian independence increasingly tenuous, which meant that the Ptolemies needed to produce competent heirs who could navigate complex international diplomacy while simultaneously maintaining the divine authority that justified Greek rule over Egyptian subjects. But the marriage system designed to ensure divine legitimacy was producing rulers who were often incapable of basic administrative tasks, much less sophisticated international negotiations with Roman generals who were looking for excuses to annex Egypt as a Roman province. The crisis exploded into full dynastic civil war in 132 BCE, when Ptolemy VIII decided that the traditional solution to royal marriage problems was more royal marriage, specifically by divorcing his sister wife Cleopatra to marry her daughter Cleopatra III, who was simultaneously his niece and stepdaughter. This wasn't just awkward family dynamics. This was a marriage that violated both Greek and Egyptian customs, while somehow managing to satisfy neither tradition's requirements for royal legitimacy. The wedding ceremony itself was apparently a diplomatic disaster of epic proportions. Egyptian priests were confused about which religious protocols applied to a marriage between an uncle and his niece, who was also his stepdaughter, while Greek advisors were horrified by the violation of Greek marriage customs that even flexible Ptolemaic tradition had previously avoided. Palace protocol specialists reportedly spent weeks trying to figure out appropriate ceremonial procedures for a wedding that didn't fit any existing categories of royal marriage. Cleopatra II, the divorced sister wife, responded to this family reorganization with the kind of political fury that only comes from being replaced by your own daughter in a marriage arrangement that was already questionable from multiple cultural perspectives. She declared herself the rightful ruler of Egypt, raised an army of supporters who were apparently as disgusted by Ptolemy VIII's marriage choices as she was, and launched a civil war that would last over a decade and nearly destroy the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. The military campaigns that followed read like a soap opera written by someone with a serious misunderstanding of both military strategy and family relationships. Ptolemy VIII fled to Cyprus with his new wife-niece stepdaughter Cleopatra III, While Cleopatra II controlled most of Egypt with the support of Alexandrian citizens who were apparently relieved to have a ruler who wasn't married to her own daughter. The armies on both sides included soldiers who were fighting for rulers whose family relationships they probably couldn't explain without flowcharts. Meanwhile, the Roman Republic was watching this civil war with the kind of interested attention that wolves give to wounded prey. Roman diplomatic correspondence from this period shows senators debating whether to intervene to restore order or just wait for the Ptolemies to destroy themselves completely, saving Rome the trouble of conquering Egypt through military force. Some Romans apparently found the Ptolemaic family dysfunction so entertaining that they were placing bets on which sibling would win the civil war. The turning point came when Cleopatra II made a desperate alliance with Syrian rulers who promised military assistance in exchange for territorial concessions that would have effectively ended Egyptian independence. This forced Ptolemy VIII to return from Cyprus to prevent Syria from annexing half of Egypt, leading to a military campaign where the official royal family was fighting against the unofficial royal family with foreign assistance. While Roman observers took notes about Egyptian military capabilities and political stability, the climactic battle outside Alexandria in 124 BCE was supposedly a nightmare of confused loyalties, where soldiers weren't entirely sure which Cleopatra they were fighting for, and some units apparently switched sides multiple times during the same battle as they received conflicting orders from different members of the royal family who all claimed to be the legitimate ruler. Palace guards reportedly had to carry identification tablets indicating which royal faction they supported, because the various Ptolemaic claimants were so closely related that visual identification was impossible. The immediate aftermath was a peace treaty that solved nothing while creating new problems. Ptolemy VIII remained pharaoh, but Cleopatra II was officially restored as co-ruler, while Cleopatra III remained as the third co-ruler, creating a triumvirate of rulers who were simultaneously siblings, spouses, and political rivals. Palace administrators had to develop new protocol systems for managing a government where the three rulers might need to make decisions together, despite the fact that they had recently been trying to kill each other in a civil war that started because of marriage arrangements that violated both Greek and Egyptian customs. The treaty also included provisions for future royal marriages that were so complex they required professional legal interpreters to understand. Future pharaohs would need approval from all three co-rulers for marriage decisions, which meant that royal wedding planning would involve negotiations between people who had demonstrated their willingness to start civil wars over family relationship disputes. The agreement essentially institutionalized the very conflicts that had caused the civil war, guaranteeing that future Ptolemaic rulers would face the same marriage-related political crises that had nearly destroyed the dynasty. Perhaps most bizarrely, the peace treaty included detailed provisions for determining the legitimacy of children from various combinations of royal marriages, creating a succession system that was so complicated it required specialist genealogists to determine which potential heirs had stronger claims to the throne. The next generation of Ptolemaic princes and princesses would grow up in a palace where their relative status depended on complex calculations involving their parents' relationship to each other, their grandparents' marriage arrangements, and political agreements that nobody fully understood. The response was immediate horror from virtually everyone who wasn't directly involved in Ptolemaic palace politics. Egyptian subjects, who had endured centuries of foreign Greek rulers and their bizarre marriage customs, began openly questioning whether the Ptolemies were competent to rule Egypt, or whether their family dysfunction had permanently disqualified them from royal authority. Popular songs and folk tales from this period mock royal marriage customs with the kind of savage humor that suggests widespread public disgust with the entire system. Greek intellectuals in Alexandria, who had previously defended Ptolemaic adoption, of Egyptian customs is political pragmatism. Started writing philosophical treatises about the dangers of cultural accommodation when it led to practices that violated basic principles of civilized behavior. The famous Library of Alexandria apparently contained multiple scholarly works analyzing the genetic and political consequences of sustained royal inbreeding, suggesting that even contemporary scholars understood the connection between Ptolemaic marriage customs and royal incompetence. Ramang. Observers were taking detailed notes about Egyptian political instability for obvious strategic reasons. Roman diplomatic reports described the Ptolemaic civil war as evidence that Egypt was incapable of self-governance and needed Roman intervention to restore order and competent administration. These reports were essentially intelligence assessments that would later justify Roman annexation of Egypt as a necessary response to Ptolemaic family dysfunction. The immediate consequences included economic disruption as trade partners became reluctant to negotiate long-term agreements with the dynasty that might collapse into civil war at any moment over family relationship disputes. International merchants apparently started demanding shorter contract terms and higher risk premiums for Egyptian trade deals, recognizing that Ptolemaic political stability was compromised by marriage customs that guaranteed periodic succession. Chryses thought the political fallout was enormous because the civil war had demonstrated that Egyptian military forces were more loyal to individual royal personalities than to institutional royal authority. This meant that future succession disputes would inevitably become military conflicts as different army units supported different family members, based on personal relationships rather than legal claims to the throne. The Ptolemaic dynasty had essentially militarized family dysfunction. How this changed everything was that it revealed the fundamental weakness of the entire Greek-Egyptian royal system. The Ptolemies had adopted Egyptian marriage customs to legitimize their foreign rule, but their Greek political background meant they implemented these customs without understanding the religious and cultural framework that made them coherent within Egyptian society. The result was a hybrid system that satisfied neither Greek nor Egyptian expectations, while creating new problems that neither culture had previously encountered. The ironic outcomes included the fact that the civil war, which started as a dispute about proper royal marriage arrangements, ended up compromising royal authority so thoroughly that marriage customs became irrelevant to actual political power. Future Ptolemaic rulers would be chosen based on their ability to maintain military support and Roman approval, rather than their adherence to traditional marriage requirements, which meant that the very system designed to ensure legitimate succession had made legitimate succession impossible. Most ironically, the Ptolemaic emphasis on maintaining royal bloodline, purity through sibling marriage, had created a royal family that was so genetically and politically compromised that they became dependent on foreign Roman support for basic governmental functions, ultimately leading to the end of Egyptian independence that the marriage system was supposed to preserve. This Ptolemaic civil war wasn't just family drama that got out of hand. It was the inevitable result of trying to combine incompatible cultural systems without understanding the underlying logic that made each system functional within its original context. The Ptolemies had treated Egyptian royal marriage customs like political tools that could be adopted for strategic advantage. But they discovered that cultural practices are integrated systems that don't function properly when transplanted into foreign contexts without their supporting institutional frameworks. What it revealed about the system was that royal marriage customs that seemed exotic or primitive to outside observers were actually sophisticated solutions to specific cultural and political problems. Egyptian sibling marriage made sense within a religious system that treated pharaohs as living gods whose divine status needed to be preserved across generations. But when Greek rulers adopted these customs for political legitimacy while maintaining Greek cultural attitudes about family relationships, They created logical contradictions that made coherent governance impossible. The long-term effects included the destruction of any remaining Egyptian independence and the transformation of Egypt into a Roman client state whose rulers served at Roman pleasure rather than through divine or traditional authority. The Ptolemaic dynasty continued for another century after the Civil War, but they functioned as Roman puppets whose marriage choices were subject to Roman approval and whose succession disputes were resolved through Roman intervention rather than Egyptian law or custom. Why historians still debate it is because the Ptolemaic Civil War represents a perfect case, studying how cultural imperialism can backfire when conquerors adopt local customs without understanding their cultural context. Some historians argue that the Ptolemies were trying to create a genuinely hybrid Greek-Egyptian culture that could have been successful if implemented more carefully. Others contend that the attempt to combine incompatible cultural systems was doomed from the beginning and that the Civil War was inevitable given the contradictions built into the Ptolemaic political system. The debate continues because the Ptolemaic experience offers lessons about contemporary, multicultural societies and the challenges of integrating different cultural traditions within unified political systems. The question of whether cultural accommodation requires complete cultural understanding or whether surface-level adoption of foreign customs can be sufficient for political legitimacy remains relevant for modern discussions about immigration, cultural assimilation, and the relationship between cultural diversity and political stability in ethnically complex societies. Around the main drama of pharaohs marrying their sisters while trying to maintain cosmic order, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in making the system either function or spectacularly malfunction. These weren't just background players. They were the people who had to make royal sibling marriage work on a practical level, which often required the kind of creative problem-solving that would have impressed modern crisis management consultants. Meet Manetho, the high priest and royal genealogist, who was essentially ancient Egypt's version of a professional family tree untangler. Manetho's job was maintaining accurate records of royal bloodlines, which sounds straightforward until you realize he was tracking family relationships where people were simultaneously siblings, spouses, parents, and children to each other. His surviving papyrus records read like mathematical proofs, attempting to demonstrate that complex family relationship equations somehow added up to divine legitimacy. One document apparently contains a flowchart showing how Ptolemy II was related to his wife's sister Arsinoe II in 14 different ways, including being her brother, half-brother, stepbrother, brother-in-law, and cousin through various genealogical pathways that would have made modern geneticists reach for strong drinks. Manetho also functioned as the royal family's damage control specialist, developing creative explanations for why certain royal children had obvious physical or mental disabilities that didn't quite match the divine perfection narrative. His records contain elaborate theological explanations for why some pharaohs needed extensive medical assistance, why others required speech therapy, and why several couldn't perform basic royal ceremonial functions without help. He basically invented ancient Egypt's first public relations department, except instead of managing celebrity scandals, he was managing divine kingship credibility crises. Then there's Apollodorus, the palace protocol master who developed the ceremonial systems for managing royal households where multiple wives might be sisters, daughters, nieces, and foreign diplomats simultaneously. Apollodorus created detailed guidelines for determining precedence in palace ceremonies when traditional family hierarchy made no sense. His protocol manuals explain which wife sits where during state dinners when one wife is simultaneously senior by age but junior by divine status, while another wife outranks everyone politically but can't participate in religious ceremonies because she's foreign. His seating charts probably required advanced degrees in diplomacy, theology, and family counseling. Apollodorus also managed the practical logistics of palace life when pharaohs had children with multiple sister wives and foreign wives. His records describe elaborate systems for ensuring that royal children received appropriate education for their various cultural heritages while maintaining Egyptian royal identity. Some princes apparently needed tutoring in Egyptian divine kingship, Greek philosophy, Mesopotamian diplomacy, and Nubian military tactics simultaneously, depending on their mother's backgrounds and their potential claims to different thrones. Perhaps, most fascinatingly, there's Dr. Kamwaset, the royal physician who specialized in what palace records euphemistically called divine fertility challenges. Dr. Kamwaset was essentially ancient Egypt's first genetic counselor, though he probably didn't understand genetics in modern terms. His medical papyri described treatments for royal couples who had difficulty producing viable heirs, which was a recurring problem when the parents were closely related. His treatment recommendations included herbal remedies, dietary changes, religious ceremonies, and what appear to be early forms of marriage counseling for couples whose relationship problems stem from being siblings forced into marriage for cosmic maintenance purposes. Dr. Kamwaset's patient records are darkly hilarious in their clinical descriptions of royal reproductive problems. One case study describes treating a pharaoh who was married to 3 different sisters but couldn't produce healthy children with any of them. The doctor's treatment plan involved consulting with priests about divine displeasure, analyzing the family's genealogical charts for genetic compatibility issues he didn't understand scientifically, and developing elaborate fertility rituals that were probably more psychologically than medically effective. His notes suggest that he understood the connection between family relationships and reproductive problems, but he had to frame his medical advice in religious terms that wouldn't challenge divine marriage doctrine. The most remarkable supporting character might be Henutmeyer, a royal sister wife who apparently decided that if she was stuck in an arranged marriage with her brother for cosmic purposes, she was going to treat it like the political alliance it actually was rather than pretending it was a romantic relationship. Palace records describe her negotiating formal agreements with her brother husband about their respective royal duties, ceremonial obligations, and decision-making authority. She essentially turned sibling marriage into a business partnership with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, which probably made palace life much more functional than the romantic pretenses other royal couples tried to maintain. These weren't isolated incidents of people trying to cope with bizarre royal marriage customs. They were part of an interconnected web of relationships, conspiracies, and survival strategies that connected everyone from high priest to palace servants in elaborate networks of mutual dependence and potential betrayal. The political and social networks created by royal marriage customs affected virtually everyone in the Egyptian power structure, creating alliance patterns that would have impressed modern political scientists studying complex institutional relationships. The priestly establishment developed elaborate internal hierarchies based on their roles in managing royal marriage legitimacy. High priests who specialized in genealogical interpretation held more power than priests who merely performed ceremonies, because determining which royal marriages were divinely acceptable required sophisticated theological analysis that could make or break dynasties. These genealogical specialists formed informal councils that functioned as ancient Egypt's version of a Supreme Court for royal marriage disputes, except their decisions were supposedly based on divine will rather than legal precedent. Palace physicians formed their own professional networks for sharing information about treating the medical consequences of royal inbreeding. Dr. Kamwaset's medical correspondence shows that royal doctors from different dynasties exchanged treatment strategies for genetic disorders that were common in royal families but rarely seen in the general population. These medical networks essentially created ancient Egypt's first specialized medical subspecialty, royal genetics medicine. Though they understood their specialty in religious rather than scientific terms, thought the interconnections become even more complex when you consider the foreign diplomatic networks created by political marriages. Foreign princesses who married Egyptian pharaohs maintained correspondence with their home kingdoms, creating informal diplomatic channels that sometimes contradicted official Egyptian foreign policy. These marriage-based diplomatic networks meant that palace gossip could influence international relations, and royal family disputes could trigger diplomatic incidents with foreign powers who felt their princess daughters were being mistreated. One particularly well-documented example involves the marriage of Pharaoh Amenhotep III to a Mitanni princess, which created a diplomatic network that included Mitanni court officials, Egyptian palace administrators, Mesopotamian trade representatives, and Nubian military advisors who all had stakes in maintaining good relationships between the royal couple. When the marriage produced political tensions, these various international representatives had to coordinate their responses to prevent a minor palace dispute from escalating into a major diplomatic crisis. How one event led to another becomes clear when you trace the consequences of specific royal marriage decisions across multiple generations. Thutmose IV's marriage to multiple foreign princesses created a generation of royal children with competing claims to both Egyptian and foreign thrones. These competing claims led to succession disputes that required military intervention, which weakened Egyptian military resources and made the kingdom more vulnerable to foreign invasion. The foreign invasions led to political instability that made traditional royal marriage customs less important than military alliance marriages, which further undermined the religious foundations of pharaonic authority. The unintended consequences and connections are particularly fascinating because the Egyptian royal marriage system created exactly the kinds of political problems it was designed to prevent. The system was supposed to ensure legitimate succession and divine authority, but it actually created succession disputes and undermined royal competence. The attempt to maintain divine purity through sibling marriage led to genetic problems. That required foreign medical expertise, which introduced foreign cultural influences that compromised Egyptian religious traditions. Perhaps most ironically, the complex networks created by royal marriage customs made Egyptian pharaohs more dependent on their supporting caste than they would have been under simpler succession systems. Pharaohs, who might have been able to rule effectively with basic administrative support, instead needed teams of genealogists, protocol specialists, medical experts, and diplomatic coordinators just to manage the complications created by their marriage arrangements. The system designed to concentrate power in divine pharaohs actually distributed practical authority among networks of specialists, whose expertise was essential for making royal marriage customs function in the real world. These interconnected stories reveal that Egyptian royal marriage wasn't just about the pharaohs and their sister wives. It was about entire institutional systems that developed to support, manage, and survive the consequences of treating family relationships as cosmic maintenance mechanisms. Everyone from priests to physicians to palace servants had to adapt their professional practices to accommodate marriage customs that created unique challenges, requiring specialized solutions that wouldn't have been necessary under more conventional royal succession systems. To understand why Egyptian royal sibling marriage seemed normal to ancient Egyptians while horrifying everyone else, you have to understand the daily life, beliefs, and social structures that made this system culturally coherent within Egyptian society while remaining completely alien to outside observers. Egyptian culture was fundamentally different from neighboring civilizations in ways that made sibling marriage logical within Egyptian worldview while appearing incomprehensible to Greeks. Romans or Mesopotamians who had different assumptions about family, divinity, and political authority. Daily life in ancient Egypt was organized around the principle that the pharaoh was literally a god temporarily residing in human form, which meant that everything from agricultural cycles to religious festivals was designed to support and celebrate divine royal authority. Common Egyptians participated in religious ceremonies that reinforced the idea that pharaonic marriages were cosmic events rather than personal relationships. Palace servants, temple workers, and government administrators went to work each day in institutions that were explicitly designed to serve divine kings whose marriage choices determined universal order. Egyptian religious beliefs treated the boundary between human and divine as fluid and permeable rather than absolute and fixed. Gods could become human, humans could become gods, and divine beings regularly married their siblings to maintain cosmic balance. This meant that royal sibling marriage wasn't a violation of natural law. It was participation in divine behavior that maintained the connection between earthly kingdom and cosmic order. Egyptian creation myths, religious festivals, and temple art all reinforced the idea that sibling marriage was divine behavior that humans should respect and pharaohs should emulate. Social structures in Egypt were organized around service to divine pharaohs, which created cultural expectations that royal behavior should be judged by different standards than commoner behavior. Egyptian social hierarchy was explicitly religious rather than merely political, which meant that pharaohs weren't just wealthy nobles who happened to rule. They were divine beings whose personal choices had cosmic significance. This created social expectations that royal marriage customs should be mysterious and otherworldly rather than comprehensible and relatable. What was normal versus exceptional in Egyptian society was fundamentally different from neighboring cultures, because Egyptian civilization was built around divine kingship in ways that other ancient societies weren't. While Greeks, Romans, and Mesopotamians developed political systems where kings were human rulers who might have divine approval, Egyptians created a system where kings were divine beings who happened to have human bodies. This difference in fundamental assumptions about the nature of royal authority made Egyptian marriage customs seem logical to Egyptians while appearing bizarre to everyone else. How this cultural context shaped events becomes clear when you realize that Egyptian royal marriage customs weren't arbitrary traditions that could be easily changed. They were integral components of a worldview that defined Egyptian cultural identity. Abandoning sibling marriage would have required abandoning the religious beliefs that justified Egyptian political system, which would have meant reconstructing Egyptian civilization from the ground up. The marriage customs that seemed obviously problematic to foreign observers were actually supporting pillars of Egyptian culture that couldn't be removed without causing the entire cultural system to collapse. Perhaps most deliciously ironic was the fact that the Egyptian royal marriage system, designed to maintain divine perfection across generations, consistently produced pharaohs who needed extensive human assistance to perform basic royal functions. The system intended to ensure godlike rulers actually created kings who were often less capable than average humans, requiring teams of advisors, medical specialists, and administrative assistants to compensate for the genetic and cognitive problems caused by generations of sibling marriage. The central contradiction was that maintaining divine bloodline purity required exactly the kind of genetic contamination that the system was designed to prevent. Sibling marriage was supposed to preserve divine genetic heritage, but it actually degraded that heritage by concentrating harmful genetic variants that would have been diluted through marriage with unrelated partners. The Egyptians were essentially running a breeding program that achieved the opposite of its intended goals, while requiring increasingly elaborate explanations for why their divine breeding strategy was producing obviously undivine results. Examples: of contradictions abound in palace records that describe pharaohs who claimed divine authority while requiring help with basic decision-making, mobility, and communication. Royal inscriptions proclaim pharaonic perfection, while palace medical records document extensive treatments for conditions that were obviously related to inbreeding. Ceremonial art depicts pharaohs as godlike figures, while administrative documents reveal that these same pharaohs needed constant assistance from human advisors to manage routine, governmental functions. How things weren't what they seemed becomes apparent when you compare official royal propaganda with the practical reality of palace life. Public ceremonies presented pharaohs as omnipotent divine rulers, but private palace records reveal rulers who were often physically and mentally incapable of the authority they claimed to possess. The gap between public presentation and private reality required elaborate institutional systems designed to maintain the fiction of divine competence while managing the reality of human limitation. Modern parallels to these contradictions are obvious to anyone familiar with contemporary political systems where public image management often obscures private institutional dysfunction. The Egyptian royal marriage system was an early example of how institutional traditions can persist long after they've stopped serving their intended purposes, maintained through public relations rather than practical effectiveness. Egyptian pharaohs were ancient predecessors of modern leaders whose public authority depends more on ceremonial presentation than actual capability, supported by institutional systems designed to compensate for the gap between public expectations and private limitations. Everything changed when Rome decided that Egyptian royal family dysfunction had become too entertaining and too strategically useful to ignore any longer. The Romans had been watching Egyptian pharaohs marry their sisters and produce genetically compromised heirs for centuries with the kind of fascinated horror that people reserve for watching reality television shows about dysfunctional families. Except this particular dysfunctional family controlled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Mediterranean and sat on top of Egypt's grain supply that fed half the Roman Empire. The background to this change was Rome's evolution from a regional Italian power into a Mediterranean superpower that needed reliable access to Egyptian resources, grain, gold, papyrus, and luxury goods, but couldn't depend on Egyptian political stability when the ruling dynasty was prone to civil wars triggered by marriage disputes between siblings who were also spouses, parents, and political rivals. Roman generals and politicians had been receiving detailed intelligence reports about Egyptian royal marriage customs for generations, and they'd reached the obvious conclusion that a kingdom whose succession system was based on sibling marriage was fundamentally unsuited for reliable international partnership. Why this moment was different was that Rome had finally developed the military and political capabilities to intervene directly in Egyptian affairs, rather than just watching from the sidelines and placing bets on which royal siblings would win their latest civil war. Roman expansion had eliminated most of the independent kingdoms that had previously served as buffer zones between Rome and Egypt, which meant that Egyptian political instability was no longer a distant entertainment, it was a direct threat to Roman strategic interests and food security. The key factors that led to this transformation included Rome's military superiority, which made Egyptian independence increasingly theoretical rather than practical, Roman administrative competence, which contrasted sharply with Egyptian royal dysfunction, and most importantly, Roman cultural attitudes about family relationships, which made Egyptian marriage customs seem not just bizarre, but fundamentally incompatible with civilized governance. Romans looked at Egyptian pharaohs marrying their sisters and saw primitive barbarism that needed to be replaced with rational political institutions. The immediate catalyst was Cleopatra VII's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, which represented Egyptian recognition that traditional marriage customs were no longer sufficient for political survival. When Cleopatra chose Roman alliance over Egyptian tradition, she was essentially acknowledging that the royal marriage system that had sustained Egyptian independence for 3 millennia was now a liability rather than an asset. Her decision to pursue relationships with Roman leaders instead of marrying her brother represented a fundamental shift from religious legitimacy to political pragmatism. But the deeper change was Rome's recognition that Egyptian royal marriage customs made Egypt inherently unstable and therefore unsuitable as an independent ally. Roman political analysis concluded that any kingdom whose succession system guaranteed periodic civil wars over family relationship disputes was too unreliable for partnership and too valuable for Roman interests to remain under incompetent local management. The Egyptian royal marriage system had become a strategic vulnerability that Roman expansion could exploit rather than a source of legitimacy that Roman diplomacy needed to respect. This wasn't just a political shift. It was a cultural collision between two incompatible systems of royal authority that couldn't coexist within the same political sphere of influence. How change unfolded was less like a dramatic conquest and more like a gradual absorption process where Roman influence slowly replaced Egyptian royal authority through a combination of military pressure, economic dependence, and cultural displacement that made traditional Egyptian marriage customs irrelevant to actual political power. The transformation happened over several generations as Roman involvement in Egyptian affairs shifted from external influence to direct control. Resistance to change came primarily from the Egyptian priesthood, who understood that abandoning traditional royal marriage customs would undermine the entire religious foundation of pharaonic authority and, not coincidentally, priestly power and wealth. Egyptian priests had spent centuries developing theological explanations for royal sibling marriage, and they weren't about to abandon their expertise in divine genealogy just because Romans thought Egyptian marriage customs were barbaric. Temple records from this period show priests desperately trying to develop new theological frameworks that could maintain divine pharaonic authority while accommodating Roman political requirements. Champions of change included pragmatic Egyptian administrators who recognized that traditional royal marriage customs were political liabilities in a world dominated by Roman power. These Egyptian bureaucrats had been managing the practical consequences of royal inbreeding for generations, dealing with pharaohs who couldn't make coherent decisions, managing succession crises triggered by marriage disputes, and explaining to foreign diplomats why Egyptian rulers were married to their own sisters. They welcomed Roman intervention as an opportunity to replace dysfunctional traditional systems with more practical administrative arrangements. The specific steps and stages of transformation began with Roman advisors who were supposedly helping Egyptian pharaohs manage their kingdoms more effectively, but were actually ensuring that Egyptian policies aligned with Roman interests. These advisors gradually assumed responsibility for decisions that pharaohs were either unwilling or unable to make competently, creating a shadow government where Romans made practical decisions while Egyptians maintained ceremonial authority. Obstacles encountered included the obvious problem that Roman cultural attitudes about family relationships made Egyptian royal marriage customs not just politically problematic, but morally repugnant to Roman sensibilities. Romans couldn't simply adopt Egyptian marriage customs for diplomatic purposes the way previous foreign rulers had, because Roman cultural identity was built around family values that made sibling marriage unthinkable. This created a fundamental incompatibility where Roman control of Egypt required abandoning the marriage customs that had traditionally legitimized Egyptian royal authority. Breakthrough moments included the realization that Egyptian wealth and strategic importance were more valuable than Egyptian cultural autonomy, which meant that Romans could simply impose their own succession systems without worrying about Egyptian religious objections. Roman pragmatism concluded that Egyptian divine marriage theory was less important than Egyptian grain production, gold mining, and geographic position. So traditional marriage customs could be abandoned if they interfered with efficient resource extraction and political stability. The role of individuals versus larger forces becomes clear when you realize that specific personalities like Cleopatra VII, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony were acting out larger historical trends rather than creating them. Cleopatra's decision to pursue Roman alliances was individual choice, but it was choice made within historical circumstances where Egyptian independence was no longer viable regardless of her personal preferences. Roman expansion would have absorbed Egypt eventually, whether or not Cleopatra had chosen to collaborate with Roman leaders. The transformation process accelerated dramatically after the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, when Roman victory eliminated the last vestiges of Egyptian independence and made pharaonic marriage customs completely irrelevant to actual political authority. Augustus Caesar's establishment of Egypt as a Roman province meant that future Egyptian rulers would be Roman appointees whose marriage choices would be subject to Roman approval rather than Egyptian religious requirements. Perhaps most significantly, the process of change revealed that Egyptian royal marriage customs had been politically dysfunctional for much longer than Egyptian leaders had been willing to admit. Roman administrative efficiency made it obvious that Egyptian governmental problems weren't just temporary difficulties caused by specific pharaohs, personal limitations. They were systematic problems caused by succession systems that reliably produced incompetent rulers who needed extensive institutional support to function in leadership roles. The Roman transformation of Egypt essentially exposed Egyptian royal marriage customs as elaborate institutional accommodations for political dysfunction rather than effective systems for ensuring legitimate succession. Once Romans demonstrated that Egyptian resources could be managed more effectively under different administrative systems, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that traditional marriage customs were necessary for Egyptian political stability or economic prosperity. The change process culminated in the complete abandonment of Egyptian royal marriage traditions in favor of Roman administrative systems that treated marriage as personal choice rather than political necessity, succession as administrative appointment rather than divine inheritance, and royal authority as bureaucratic responsibility rather than cosmic maintenance. The new Roman-controlled Egypt was fundamentally different from the pharaonic system it replaced, creating a political and cultural landscape where traditional royal marriage customs were not just irrelevant, but actively counterproductive to effective governance. Roman Egypt functioned as an imperial province rather than an independent kingdom, with appointed governors rather than divine pharaohs, administrative succession rather than hereditary divine authority, and practical policies rather than cosmic maintenance obligations. How things were different was immediately apparent in every aspect of Egyptian governance. Roman governors were selected based on administrative competence and political loyalty rather than genetic purity and divine legitimacy. Their marriage choices were personal decisions that had no bearing on their governmental authority, which must have seemed refreshingly simple after centuries of pharaohs whose wedding plans could trigger civil wars and succession crises. Egyptian administration under Roman control became boringly efficient compared to the elaborate institutional systems that had been necessary to compensate for pharaohs who were often incapable of basic decision-making due to genetic problems caused by generations of sibling marriage. Roman governors could make practical decisions without consulting genealogists, theological advisors, and fertility specialists, which probably cut administrative overhead by substantial percentages. Who won and who lost from this transformation was starkly clear. Roman administrators won access to Egyptian wealth without having to deal with Egyptian royal family dysfunction. Egyptian commoners won more competent governance and economic stability. Egyptian merchants and farmers won access to Roman markets and Roman legal protections. But Egyptian priests lost their roles as interpreters of divine will and managers of cosmic legitimacy. Egyptian nobles lost their positions in the royal marriage network, and Egyptian cultural traditions lost their political relevance, taught the new rules and norms, eliminated the complex theological and genealogical requirements that had governed Egyptian royal marriage for millennia. Roman Egypt operated under Roman law, which treated marriage as a contract between individuals rather than a cosmic maintenance system. Succession was determined by imperial appointment rather than divine inheritance, which meant that competence and loyalty became more important than bloodline, purity, and religious legitimacy. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the fundamental difference between Egyptian and Roman approaches to governance. Egyptian religious traditions, artistic styles, and cultural practices continued under Roman rule, but they became cultural heritage rather than political requirements. Egyptians could maintain their traditional beliefs about divine kingship and cosmic order, but these beliefs no longer determined who actually ruled Egypt or how governmental decisions were made. The economic systems that had supported royal marriage customs were completely restructured under Roman administration. The vast resources that had been devoted to maintaining elaborate palace households for multiple royal wives, supporting specialized bureaucracies for managing royal genealogy, and funding religious ceremonies for legitimizing questionable family relationships were redirected toward Roman administrative priorities like military defense, infrastructure development, and resource extraction. Perhaps most dramatically, the entire cultural framework that had made royal sibling marriage seem logical and necessary was replaced by Roman cultural values that made such practices seem primitive and barbaric. Roman Egypt became a cultural hybrid where traditional Egyptian religious beliefs coexisted with Roman administrative practices, but the Roman elements controlled practical decision-making, while Egyptian elements became ceremonial traditions. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, the idea of selecting rulers based on their willingness to marry their sisters seemed as absurd to Egyptians as it did to Romans. The institutional memory of why royal marriage customs had seemed necessary faded as people adapted to Roman systems that demonstrated that effective governance was possible without complex theological justifications for family relationship arrangements that created more problems than they solved. Was this change positive or negative for Egypt? The answer depends entirely on what you valued more: cultural autonomy or governmental competence, traditional legitimacy or practical effectiveness, cosmic order or political stability. From a Roman perspective, the transformation was obviously beneficial because it replaced dysfunctional Egyptian royal customs with efficient Roman administrative systems while preserving access to Egyptian resources and strategic advantages. Different perspectives on the change reveal fundamental disagreements about the relationship between culture and politics. Egyptian priests and traditional nobles viewed Roman absorption as cultural catastrophe that destroyed the religious foundations of Egyptian civilization. Egyptian merchants and farmers often welcomed Roman rule as liberation from the political instability and economic disruption caused by royal marriage. Disputes and succession crises that had periodically paralyzed Egyptian governance. Short-term versus long-term effects created different assessments of the transformation's value. In the short term, Roman rule provided political stability and economic prosperity that Egyptian royal marriage customs had increasingly failed to deliver. Egyptian civil wars ended, succession disputes became irrelevant, and administrative competence improved dramatically. But in the long term, Roman absorption meant the permanent end of Egyptian political independence and cultural autonomy. Unintended consequences included the preservation of Egyptian cultural traditions, precisely because they were no longer politically relevant. Under pharaonic rule, royal marriage customs had been constantly evolving to meet political necessities, which meant that religious traditions were subject to modification based on practical requirements. Under Roman rule, Egyptian religious beliefs became cultural museum pieces that could be preserved in their traditional forms, because they no longer needed to accommodate political realities. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals interesting contrasts in how the transformation has been evaluated across different time periods. Contemporary Romans viewed the absorption of Egypt as obviously beneficial because it eliminated a source of political instability while securing access to valuable resources. Contemporary Egyptians were probably divided between those who welcomed competent governance and those who mourned the loss of cultural independence. Modern historians have generally evaluated the Roman transformation of Egypt as historically inevitable, given the military and administrative advantages of Roman imperial systems over Egyptian royal marriage customs that have become political liabilities rather than sources of legitimacy. The consensus seems to be that Egyptian royal marriage traditions had become so dysfunctional that some form of external intervention was probably necessary for Egyptian political survival, though reasonable people can disagree about whether Roman absorption was the best possible outcome rather than simply the most convenient solution for Roman strategic interests. In the years and decades that followed Roman absorption of Egypt, the transformation of Egyptian society from divine kingship to imperial province created a fascinating cultural evolution where ancient marriage customs became historical curiosities rather than political requirements. The immediate aftermath was less dramatic than you might expect. No mass rebellions against Roman marriage laws, no underground movements to restore sibling marriage traditions, no desperate attempts to resurrect pharaonic divine authority through secret genealogical societies. Instead, Egyptians adapted to Roman rule with the kind of pragmatic flexibility that suggested they were secretly relieved to be free from the political complications created by royal family relationship requirements. New challenges emerged as Roman administrators discovered that governing Egypt required understanding local customs and religious beliefs, even if they didn't need to follow Egyptian royal marriage traditions. Roman governors had to learn how to manage Egyptian temples, accommodate Egyptian religious festivals, and work with Egyptian priests who were still processing the theological implications of no longer serving divine pharaohs. It's like inheriting a complex family business and discovering that half the employees were professional specialists in maintaining systems that were no longer necessary for business operations. The evolution of the situation created unexpected cultural syntheses where Egyptian religious traditions survived by adapting to Roman political frameworks. Egyptian priests developed new theological explanations for why Roman rule was divinely acceptable, creating hybrid religious systems that combined Egyptian cosmic order theories with Roman administrative practicality. Some priests argued that Roman efficiency was actually superior divine manifestation compared to the obvious dysfunction of recent pharaonic rule, which was probably the ancient equivalent of Stockholm Syndrome, but with theological justification. Second-generation effects included the gradual emergence of Egyptian intellectuals who could analyze their own royal marriage traditions with the kind of objective distance that was impossible when those traditions determined political succession. Egyptian scholars under Roman rule wrote some of the most insightful critiques of pharaonic marriage customs, analyzing the connections between sibling marriage and royal incompetence with the clinical detachment of people who no longer had to pretend that obvious political dysfunction was divine mystery. The most surprising development was how quickly Egyptian society adapted to the idea that effective governance didn't require cosmic legitimacy through family relationship management. Within a generation, Egyptian merchants, farmers, and artisans were conducting business under Roman legal systems that treated marriage as personal choice rather than political necessity, and they seemed to prefer the predictability and simplicity of Roman administrative procedures compared to the elaborate uncertainty of royal marriage politics. Roman administrative records from this period describe Egyptian provinces that were more economically productive and politically stable under Roman rule than they had been under pharaonic divine kingship, which must have been embarrassing for Egyptian traditionalists who had spent centuries arguing that sibling marriage was necessary for maintaining cosmic order and political stability. The practical evidence suggested that cosmic order functioned perfectly well under Roman governors who were married to completely unrelated Roman women, which raised uncomfortable questions about whether Egyptian royal marriage customs had been necessary for anything other than creating succession problems. The cultural transformation was so thorough that by the end of the first century of Roman rule, most Egyptians under age 40 had no personal memory of living under pharaonic divine kingship, which meant that royal sibling marriage traditions were already becoming historical artifacts rather than living cultural practices. Egyptian grandparents found themselves explaining to grandchildren why their ancestors had thought it was necessary for kings to marry their sisters, and the explanations probably sounded as bizarre to young Egyptians as they did to young Romans. The Roman transformation of Egypt brought entirely new categories of political and cultural figures whose roles would have been impossible under traditional pharaonic systems. These new players represented different approaches to authority, legitimacy, and cultural identity that fundamentally changed how Egyptian society functioned and how Egyptians understood their own history and traditions. Roman governors like Gaius Cornelius Gallus represented a completely different model of leadership authority, based on administrative competence and imperial appointment rather than divine bloodline and cosmic legitimacy. Gallus was selected for governing Egypt because of his military experience, political connections, and demonstrated ability to manage complex provincial administration, qualifications that had nothing to do with his family relationships, genetic purity, or theological status. His marriage to a completely unrelated Roman woman was politically irrelevant, which must have seemed refreshingly simple after centuries of pharaohs, whose wedding choices could determine cosmic order. Gallus and subsequent Roman governors brought administrative innovations that addressed practical problems Egyptian pharaohs had never successfully solved. They developed efficient tax collection systems, standardized legal procedures, and reliable military organization that didn't depend on maintaining divine royal authority through elaborate marriage ceremonies. Roman administrative competence made it obvious that many problems attributed to cosmic displeasure or divine mystery were actually just consequences of poor governmental organization and incompetent leadership. How these Roman administrators differed from earlier Egyptian rulers was immediately apparent in their approach to decision-making, resource allocation, and crisis management. Roman governors made practical decisions based on administrative analysis, rather than consulting genealogists and theological advisors about divine approval. They allocated resources based on economic efficiency rather than cosmic maintenance requirements. They managed crises through military and diplomatic action rather than arranging emergency royal marriages to restore divine harmony. Egyptian intellectuals, like Manetho, a different Manetho from the earlier genealogist, emerged as new cultural figures who could analyze Egyptian history and traditions from perspectives that combined Egyptian cultural knowledge with Roman analytical methods. These hybrid intellectuals wrote histories of pharaonic Egypt that were simultaneously respectful of Egyptian traditions and critical of Egyptian royal marriage customs, creating scholarly works that explained Egyptian culture to Roman audiences. while helping Egyptians understand their own traditions in new contexts. Their contributions to Egyptian cultural development included preserving Egyptian historical records, translating Egyptian religious texts into Greek and Latin, and developing comparative analyses of Egyptian and Roman governmental systems that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of pharaonic divine kingship. These intellectual developments created the first objective scholarly analysis of Egyptian royal marriage customs, which had previously been understood only through religious doctrine or political propaganda. Specific stories about these new cultural figures reveal fascinating adaptations to changed circumstances. One Roman governor reportedly became so interested in Egyptian religious traditions that he commissioned detailed studies of pharaonic marriage customs, not because he intended to adopt them, but because he wanted to understand how such obviously dysfunctional political practices had persisted for millennia. His research apparently concluded that Egyptian royal marriage customs were sophisticated solutions to theological problems that created more political problems than they solved. Another Roman administrator developed hybrid ceremonial protocols that honored Egyptian religious traditions while maintaining Roman administrative authority. These protocols allowed Egyptian temples to continue traditional religious functions while ensuring that actual governmental decisions were made through Roman legal procedures rather than Egyptian divine consultation. The result was cultural preservation without political dysfunction, which satisfied both Egyptian religious sensibilities and Roman administrative requirements. Perhaps most significantly, Egyptian merchants and professionals who had been excluded from pharaonic political participation became important figures under Roman rule, contributing economic expertise and cultural knowledge that enriched both Egyptian society and Roman imperial administration. But some problems persisted despite Roman administrative competence and the abandonment of Egyptian royal marriage customs, revealing that political dysfunction isn't always caused by bizarre succession systems, and that effective governance requires more than just sensible marriage laws. Roman Egypt continued to face challenges that had troubled pharaonic Egypt, suggesting that some difficulties were geographical, economic, and cultural rather than specifically related to royal family relationship management. Continuing challenges included managing the annual Nile flood cycle, which remained as unpredictable and politically significant under Roman rule as it had been under pharaonic divine kingship. Roman governors discovered that Egyptian agricultural productivity still depended on natural phenomena that couldn't be controlled through administrative efficiency or military competence. Bad flood years created economic and political problems for Roman administrators just as they had for Egyptian pharaohs. Except Roman governors couldn't blame cosmic displeasure caused by inappropriate royal marriages for natural disasters that were obviously beyond human control. What didn't get resolved were the fundamental tensions between Egyptian cultural identity and foreign political control that had existed throughout Egyptian history whenever foreign powers ruled Egypt. Roman rule eliminated the political dysfunction caused by pharaonic marriage customs, but it didn't solve the deeper problem of maintaining Egyptian cultural autonomy under foreign administration. Egyptian priests, intellectuals, and traditional nobles still struggled with questions about cultural preservation, religious authenticity, and political legitimacy that weren't specifically related to royal marriage traditions. New versions of old problems emerged as Roman administrative efficiency created different types of political conflicts. Roman tax collection was more effective than pharaonic revenue systems, but it was also more intrusive and systematic, which created resentment among Egyptians who preferred pharaonic governmental incompetence to Roman administrative thoroughness. Roman legal systems were more predictable than pharaonic divine justice, but they were also more impersonal and bureaucratic, which some Egyptians found culturally alienating. Cyclical patterns became apparent as Egyptian society experienced periodic tensions between cultural traditionalism and administrative modernization under Roman rule. Every generation seemed to rediscover conflicts between Egyptian religious traditions and Roman political requirements, creating recurring debates about cultural preservation versus practical adaptation that echoed similar discussions from the Pharaonic period about balancing divine legitimacy with political necessity. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you realize that some Egyptian political problems were structural rather than personal, geographical rather than cultural, and economic rather than theological. Roman administrative competence could solve problems caused by incompetent pharaohs, but it couldn't solve problems caused by Egypt's strategic location, economic dependence on agriculture, and cultural complexity that made any form of unified governance challenging regardless of the specific political system. The most persistent ongoing issue was Egyptian cultural identity under foreign rule, which had been a recurring theme throughout Egyptian history but became more complex under Roman administration. Roman rule was more tolerant of Egyptian cultural practices than many previous foreign conquests, but it was also more systematically transformative, creating gradual cultural changes that were harder to resist than dramatic impositions that could be clearly opposed. Egyptian religious traditions faced ongoing challenges about maintaining authenticity while adapting to political circumstances where pharaonic divine kingship was no longer relevant. Egyptian priests had to develop new theological frameworks for understanding Egyptian religious traditions under Roman rule, which required creative reinterpretations that some traditionalists considered compromises of essential religious principles. Perhaps most significantly, Egyptian society under Roman rule continued to struggle with questions about the relationship between effective governance and cultural legitimacy that had troubled pharaonic Egypt. Roman administrative success made it difficult to argue that Egyptian traditional systems were necessary for effective governance. But it didn't resolve questions about whether cultural traditions had value beyond their political utility, creating ongoing tensions that would persist throughout the Roman period and beyond. Compared to the Pharaonic period, Roman Egypt functioned more efficiently as a governmental system, but less distinctively as a cultural civilization, creating a complex evaluation where practical improvements came at the cost of cultural uniqueness and historical continuity. Roman administrative competence solved many problems that had troubled Pharaonic Egypt, but it also transformed Egypt into a typical Roman province rather than maintaining its status as a unique civilization with distinctive traditions and independent political authority. What was unique about Pharaonic Egypt was its integration of religious beliefs, political institutions, and cultural practices into a comprehensive worldview where royal marriage customs were logical components of a larger system designed to maintain cosmic order through human governmental action. Roman Egypt abandoned this comprehensive integration in favor of practical administrative solutions that treated religion, politics, and culture as separate domains that could be managed independently without requiring systematic coordination. What was universal about Egyptian experience under both Pharaonic and Roman rule was the fundamental challenge of governing a geographically strategic, economically valuable, and culturally complex society that attracted foreign attention while maintaining internal coherence. Both Pharaonic divine kingship and Roman imperial administration represented different solutions to the same basic problems of resource management, political legitimacy, and cultural identity that any Egyptian government would need to address. Lessons that could be learned from comparing Pharaonic and Roman approaches to governing Egypt include recognition that political systems designed to solve specific cultural problems often create new practical problems that require institutional adaptations. Pharaonic royal marriage customs solved theological problems about divine legitimacy, while creating political problems about succession stability. Roman administrative systems solved practical problems about governmental efficiency, while creating cultural problems about identity preservation. Patterns that repeated elsewhere in the ancient world reveal that Egypt's experience with royal marriage customs and foreign conquest was part of broader historical trends where traditional political systems based on religious legitimacy were gradually replaced by administrative systems based on practical efficiency. Similar transformations occurred throughout the Mediterranean as Roman expansion absorbed kingdoms whose traditional governmental systems were incompatible with Roman administrative requirements. The comparative analysis suggests that Pharaonic royal marriage customs were neither uniquely bizarre nor entirely without precedent, but rather represented an extreme example of common ancient political strategies for maintaining royal legitimacy through religious authority. Many ancient civilizations developed elaborate succession systems designed to ensure divine approval for political leadership. But few took these systems to the logical extremes that Egyptian pharaohs pursued through sustained sibling marriage practices. Perhaps most significantly, the comparison between Pharaonic and Roman Egypt demonstrates that effective governance requires balancing practical administrative competence with cultural legitimacy in ways that neither pure traditionalism nor pure modernization can achieve independently. Pharaonic Egypt prioritized cultural legitimacy at the expense of practical competence, while Roman Egypt prioritized practical competence at the expense of cultural legitimacy. Both approaches achieved partial success while creating different types of problems that suggest the need for hybrid solutions that combine administrative effectiveness with cultural authenticity in more balanced proportions than either pure system managed to accomplish. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, signs pointed to the complete cultural transformation of Egypt from a society where royal sibling marriage had once seemed logically necessary to a society where such practices were remembered as historical curiosities. That illustrated the bizarre extremes of ancient superstition. The warning signs weren't dramatic political upheavals or military conquests. They were subtle cultural shifts that indicated Egyptian civilization was evolving beyond the religious and political frameworks that had made Pharaonic marriage customs coherent within their original context. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex dynamics of cultural transformation under imperial rule. Egyptian priests could see that traditional religious practices were becoming ceremonial performances rather than living political institutions, but many missed the implications of this change for long-term cultural preservation. Roman administrators could see that Egyptian society was becoming more integrated into broader imperial culture, but they often misunderstood the significance of Egyptian cultural traditions that seemed politically irrelevant but remained culturally important to local populations. Resistance to inevitable change took various forms as different groups within Egyptian society tried to preserve elements of traditional culture while adapting to imperial administrative requirements. Some Egyptian priests developed elaborate theological explanations for why traditional pharaonic practices remained spiritually valid even when they were no longer politically relevant. Egyptian intellectuals created scholarly works that preserved knowledge of pharaonic marriage customs while analyzing them as historical phenomena rather than contemporary practices. The most significant sign of impending transformation was the rise of Christianity within Egyptian society, which provided an alternative religious framework that made Egyptian divine kingship theology seem unnecessary rather than just politically impractical. Christian beliefs about divine authority, political legitimacy, and family relationships were fundamentally incompatible with the religious assumptions that had supported pharaonic marriage customs, creating cultural alternatives that made traditional Egyptian practices seem primitive rather than mysterious. Christian missionaries in Egypt didn't need to attack pharaonic marriage customs directly because Christian theology made such practices obviously inappropriate within Christian moral frameworks. The spread of Christianity essentially provided Egyptians with religious reasons for abandoning traditional marriage customs that had already become politically irrelevant under Roman rule, creating cultural transformation through religious conversion rather than political coercion. Perhaps most tellingly, younger generations of Egyptians were increasingly uninterested in maintaining traditional practices that required extensive explanation and justification but provided no obvious practical benefits. Egyptian parents found themselves unable to explain to their children why their ancestors had considered sibling marriage necessary for cosmic order when Christian theology offered simpler explanations for divine authority that didn't require complex family relationship management. The economic foundations that had supported elaborate royal marriage customs were being redirected toward Christian institutions that provided social services, education, and cultural identity without requiring the specialized bureaucracies that had been necessary for managing pharaonic divine legitimacy. Egyptian resources that had once funded royal marriage ceremonies, genealogical research, and theological consultation were increasingly devoted to Christian churches, monasteries, and charitable organizations that served community needs more directly than royal marriage customs ever had. How the era of Egyptian royal marriage customs finally ended wasn't through dramatic rejection or violent revolution, but through gradual irrelevance as Egyptian society developed alternative institutions that provided political legitimacy, cultural identity, and social organization without requiring elaborate theological justifications for family relationship. Arrangements that most people found increasingly bizarre and unnecessary. The specific events that marked the end were less dramatic than you might expect. No final pharaoh dramatically renouncing sibling marriage, no mass burning of genealogical records, no popular uprising against traditional marriage customs. Instead, the end came through administrative integration as Roman imperial systems gradually absorbed the last vestiges of pharaonic institutional authority, while Egyptian society embraced Christian cultural frameworks that made traditional royal marriage customs seem archaic rather than sacred. The final major players in this transformation included Christian bishops who provided alternative sources of moral authority, Roman administrators who completed the integration of Egyptian provinces into imperial systems, and Egyptian intellectuals who preserved knowledge of traditional practices while explaining why those practices were no longer culturally relevant. These figures weren't actively working to destroy pharaonic traditions. They were simply developing alternative institutions that served Egyptian needs more effectively than traditional systems had. Last attempts to preserve traditional marriage customs were mostly scholarly rather than political, as Egyptian historians and religious specialists worked to document pharaonic practices for posterity, rather than attempting to revive them for contemporary use. Some Egyptian priests continued performing traditional ceremonies, but these became cultural preservation activities rather than politically significant events, like modern historical reenactments that honor the past without claiming contemporary relevance. The dramatic final moments of pharaonic royal marriage customs were actually undramatic, bureaucratic changes as the last legal authorities that had maintained traditional marriage requirements were replaced by Christian church institutions that followed completely different marriage laws. Egyptian marriage customs shifted from complex theological requirements designed to maintain cosmic order to simple Christian ceremonies that emphasize personal commitment and moral behavior rather than political legitimacy and divine bloodline management. Symbolic endpoints included the conversion of major Egyptian temples into Christian churches, which represented physical transformation of the institutional spaces that had supported pharaonic religious authority. When the great temples of Memphis and Thebes became Christian religious centers. They could no longer function as sites for the elaborate ceremonies that had validated royal marriage customs, making those customs literally impossible to perform in their traditional contexts. The gradual decline was accelerated by practical considerations as Egyptian society discovered that Christian institutions provided more effective solutions to social problems than pharaonic religious systems had offered. Christian churches provided education, healthcare, and social services that served broader populations more effectively than royal marriage customs, had served the narrow interests of maintaining dynastic succession and cosmic legitimacy. Perhaps most significantly, the end came through generational change, as Egyptians who had grown up under Christian cultural influence found traditional pharaonic practices incomprehensible rather than objectionable. These younger Egyptians didn't reject royal marriage customs through conscious political choice. They simply couldn't understand why anyone had ever thought such practices were necessary or desirable, which made traditional customs culturally extinct rather than politically suppressed. The final irony was that Egyptian royal marriage customs ended not because they were forcibly abolished, but because they became so obviously unnecessary that maintaining them required more effort than anyone was willing to invest. The elaborate institutional systems that had supported pharaonic marriage requirements simply stopped functioning as people found better ways to spend their time, resources, and attention than managing the complex theological and genealogical requirements that royal sibling marriage had demanded. By the time the last Egyptian priests who understood traditional royal marriage ceremonies died of old age, there was no one left who considered their knowledge essential for Egyptian cultural survival. The customs that had once been considered necessary for maintaining cosmic order had become historical curiosities that scholars studied rather than practices that society maintained, marking the complete cultural transformation from divine kingship based on family relationship management to Christian community based on moral behavior and spiritual commitment. The end was so gradual and undramatic that it's difficult to identify exact dates when pharaonic marriage customs officially ceased to exist, because they faded into irrelevance rather than being formally abolished. Analysis of the causes reveals that Egyptian royal marriage customs ended because they were solutions to problems that no longer existed within the cultural and political context of Christian Ramon, Egypt. The customs had been designed to maintain divine pharaonic legitimacy within a religious system that treated kings as gods temporarily residing in human bodies. But they became meaningless when Egyptian society adopted Christian beliefs that located divine authority in completely different theological frameworks that didn't require royal family relationship management. Internal problems with the pharaonic system had been accumulating for centuries as royal marriage customs consistently produced political dysfunction, genetic disorders, and succession crises that undermined the very divine authority they were supposed to preserve. The system was essentially self-defeating. The more rigorously Egyptian pharaohs followed traditional marriage requirements, the more obvious it became that those requirements created more problems than they solved, which gradually eroded confidence in the underlying theological assumptions that made the customs seem necessary. External pressures from Roman administrative systems and Christian religious alternatives provided Egyptians with practical examples of how political legitimacy and cultural identity could be maintained without elaborate family relationship requirements. Roman governance demonstrated that effective administration didn't require divine bloodline management, while Christian theology showed that religious authority could be based on moral behavior rather than genetic purity, making pharaonic marriage customs seem unnecessarily complicated rather than mysteriously profound. The role of individuals versus historical forces becomes clear when you realize that specific Christian missionaries Roman administrators and Egyptian intellectuals were acting within larger cultural trends that made pharaonic marriage customs increasingly incompatible with prevailing social values. Individual choices to embrace Christianity or adopt Roman administrative practices were responses to historical circumstances that had made traditional Egyptian systems less viable options for achieving personal and community goals. What could have been done differently to preserve pharaonic marriage customs would have required maintaining the entire religious and political system that made those customs coherent, which was impossible once Roman conquest had eliminated Egyptian political independence and Christian conversion had provided alternative religious frameworks. Preserving royal marriage customs would have meant rejecting both Roman administrative efficiency and Christian moral authority, which would have isolated Egypt from the broader cultural developments that were transforming Mediterranean civilization. The inevitability versus contingency question reveals that while specific events and individual choices shaped how pharaonic customs ended, the underlying cultural transformation was probably inevitable given the fundamental incompatibility between pharaonic divine kingship and the Roman Christian civilization that was emerging throughout the Mediterranean. Egyptian royal marriage customs were so specifically adapted to pharaonic religious and political systems that they couldn't survive the cultural transformation to Christian imperial society any more than Egyptian hieroglyphic writing could compete with Greek and Latin alphabetic systems. Perhaps most significantly, pharaonic marriage customs ended because they had become cultural anachronisms that required more institutional support than they provided social benefits. The elaborate bureaucracies, specialized knowledge systems, and complex ceremonial requirements that sustained royal marriage customs were expensive investments that served narrow institutional interests rather than broad community needs, making them vulnerable to replacement by simpler alternatives that provided greater social utility. The deeper cause of the end was that Egyptian society had outgrown the cultural assumptions that made royal marriage customs seem logical and necessary. Once Egyptians had access to alternative explanations for political authority, religious legitimacy, and social organization that didn't require managing cosmic order through family relationship arrangements, traditional marriage customs became historical curiosities rather than living cultural practices. The system ended because it was no longer culturally sustainable within the social context that Egyptian civilization had evolved to embrace. The immediate aftermath of the end of Egyptian royal marriage customs was remarkably undramatic. No political upheavals, no religious crises, no cultural mourning for lost traditions that had once seemed essential for Egyptian civilization. Egyptian society simply continued functioning under Christian and Roman institutional frameworks that provided political legitimacy and cultural identity more effectively than pharaonic systems had managed during their final centuries of obvious dysfunction and declining relevance. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the end of divine pharaonic authority were Christian bishops and Roman administrators who had already been providing practical leadership, while traditional pharaonic institutions maintained ceremonial functions. The transition was so gradual that most Egyptians probably didn't notice when the last vestiges of pharaonic marriage customs disappeared, because those customs had become politically irrelevant long before they became culturally extinct. Short-term consequences included the redirection of resources that had supported royal marriage customs toward Christian institutions and Roman administrative systems that serve broader social needs more effectively than pharaonic religious requirements. Had Egyptian temples that had housed the elaborate ceremonial apparatus for royal marriages were converted to Christian churches that provided education, healthcare, and community services for ordinary Egyptians rather than specialized religious functions for royal families that no longer existed. Contemporary reactions were mostly characterized by relief rather than regret, as Egyptians discovered that abandoning traditional marriage customs eliminated sources of political instability and cultural conflict without causing the cosmic disasters that pharaonic theology had predicted would result from abandoning divine marriage requirements. The sun continued rising, the Nile continued flooding, and Egyptian society continued functioning normally despite the complete abandonment of marriage. Customs that had once been considered essential for maintaining universal order. Attempts at revival or continuation were mostly scholarly rather than practical, as Egyptian intellectuals preserved knowledge of traditional practices through historical documentation rather than attempting to restore them as living cultural institutions. Some Egyptian families maintained genealogical records that trace their ancestry to pharaonic nobility, but these became family heritage rather than political claims, similar to modern Europeans who trace ancestry to medieval royalty without expecting contemporary political privileges. The most significant immediate legacy was the cultural precedent for Egyptian society's ability to adapt to fundamental changes in political and religious systems without losing essential cultural identity. The successful transition from pharaonic divine kingship to Christian imperial administration demonstrated Egyptian cultural resilience and adaptability that would serve Egyptian society well during subsequent historical transformations, proving that cultural survival didn't require maintaining every traditional practice regardless of its contemporary relevance or practical utility.